Hi everyone, welcome to episode 72 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. A few quick notes from me before we get into today's episode. Later this week, I'll be launching a new segment of the podcast called the Startup Playbook Hustle, which will feature some of the best up-and-coming founders sharing their stories, lessons, and future plans. If you're interested in being featured on the Startup Playbook Hustle, email me at rohit@startupplaybook.co or fill out the application form in the show notes for this episode. Also, if you follow me on social media, you might have seen that I was shortlisted for TechBoard's Startup Community Award. I'm extremely humbled to have been nominated alongside some of the other startup community leaders in our ecosystem. You can have a look at the other nominees and vote for your favorite on the TechBoard award page, which I'll also include in the show notes for this episode at startupplaybook.co. So, back to episode 72. Following on from last week's episode, today's guest is another interview from the TechCrunch Battlefield Australia event, and another big shout out to Julia Wells for teeing up the interview. My guest for this episode is serial entrepreneur Aaron Patzer. Aaron started his career at IBM before founding two web development and online marketing companies. He then went on to become an architect and technical lead for the San Jose division of Nascentric before deciding to found his own startup. He attended and won at the very first TechCrunch Battlefield event with the little-known personal finance app at that time called Mint.com, which grew to over 1.5 million users and sold to Intuit within 2 years for $170 million. He then founded Fountain, an on-demand answers app that again sold within 2 years to Porch for an undisclosed fee. He is now onto his third company, Vital Software, which is an AI software that is a mobile check-in for patients and automatically creates electronic medical records designed for doctors and nurses, with the aim being to cut ER wait times in half. In this interview, we talk about building startups as a solo founder, the value of equity, and solving big problems. Without further ado, here is my interview with Aaron Patzer. Hi Aaron, welcome to the Startup Playbook Podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So for those people that may not be familiar with your background, you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Sure. So I am an American entrepreneur. Spent most of my career in San Francisco. So I'm initially trained as an electrical engineer and computer scientist. I've worked on everything from DNA sequencing hardware to the PlayStation 3 microprocessor. I have 3 patents in that. But I am best known for a company I started 10 years ago called Mint, which is the largest personal finance tool in the US and Canada. I think it's used by 25 million people. And it's something that pulled together all of your credit cards, bank accounts, investments, student loans, mortgages together in one place to let you see a complete financial picture. And then it would tell you, as a free product, it would tell you you should move your money from here to there because it would give you a better interest rate, or you should pay this off first, or you should consolidate your loans into one loan. And so it was a form of advertising where we guaranteed that you would only see a recommendation if it would save you at least $500 a year. That turned out to be a pretty successful, beneficial model for everybody involved. And I sold the company to Intuit in 2009 for $172 million, became the head of the personal finance group there. Found myself at age 28 being an officer of a big 9,000 person publicly traded company, which was a bit of a culture shock, and I was probably dramatically underqualified for to manage 100 people and $120 million in business. But I did that, and then eventually became vice president of product innovation across the company, working on products like QuickBooks and TurboTax. Left after my contract there ended and started a company called Fountain. Fountain was video chat with experts, so it did a lot of natural language processing. You could enter any question on any topic, and it would figure out who the best person in the world to sort of answer that question was, or the best person in our network to answer that question was, and then put you in touch through video chat and screen sharing to solve it. And so some of our popular categories were kind of telemedicine, speaking to a lawyer on anything from immigration to contract law. Veterinary was a big category for us, as well as home improvement. Instead of paying a $100 call out to a plumber or an electrician, they would just show you how to do it on your own. because most of it was simpler than you think. Ended up selling that company not at the price that Mint fetched, but to a company called Porch in Seattle, which is big in the home improvement space. And that was fall of 2015. 2 or 3 days later, I moved to Auckland, New Zealand. That's where my partner Rebecca is from. And we spent the first 5 months in New Zealand walking from the tip of the North Island to the bottom of the South Island,
Wow.
Completely non-tech related. Just spent 116 days in tents and huts and human-powered across a whole long country. And then came out, wasn't quite sure what I was going to do next, and started working with my sister, who's a professor of kidney transplant research in the States, and we were able to predict with more accuracy whether kidney transplants would work using natural language processing on doctor notes. And then my brother-in-law, who's an emergency room doctor, said, you know what, I ask people the same 10 questions every time they walk into the emergency room, which is, why are you here? Has this ever happened before? How long have you been in pain? Have you ever had surgery for this? And I said, well, you know, I could probably take those answers, ask those questions with a simple web app, process the natural language in whatever format it comes in. And we were able to make a prediction with about 90% accuracy about whether somebody would be admitted to the hospital, which means they stay overnight, or whether they would be treated, put into a cast, given drugs, whatever, and discharged. And that got me into my current startup, which is called Vital Software. We're located in Auckland, New Zealand, which does emergency room software with a lot of machine learning, natural language processing, artificial intelligence. And it's been great to get back in to do another startup, and I do a lot of the coding, a lot of the algorithms myself.
Fantastic. Obviously, you've done some incredible things and had some incredible success. I just want to hone in on the 5 months that you spent in New Zealand walking through. Was that, did you feel any change going through that? I just spent 3 weeks in South America, so obviously nowhere near as long. But just the forced time off internet and not having to look at the day-to-day of the business and forcing myself to just really have the time to be more introspective around everything that we're doing and the purpose behind it was really meaningful to me. I'm just curious of what that sort of 5 months was like for you.
It was probably the best, most memorable 5 or 6 month time period of my entire life, actually. I don't think we often in the professional world give ourselves the permission to take half a year. What career opportunities am I going to miss out on? How much is the world going to change? How could I possibly take off that amount of time? I'd never be able to come back to my job. I'd never be able to ask my boss for that time off. And the world actually doesn't change that fast, but you would get tremendous meaning from doing what I guess in Australia and New Zealand is called like a gap year, but as a proper adult, when you actually have the life experience to reflect back, and but you're still young enough that you can change everything going forward.
Sure. Did that help shape your decision to start Vital, or was that two completely sort of separate?
No, I think it did. In the time period between Mint and Fountain, and keep in mind, I was the only founder. I'd sold a company for a lot of money when I was 28. I pretty much thought I was invincible. So I thought, what is the biggest challenge that I could tackle? And I worked on magnetic levitation vehicles for transportation. This was back in 2011. This was before any of the Hyperloop stuff came out. I had actually talked to Elon Musk about this way back when, on a couple of camping trips. And the truth of the matter is, the technology worked. I got that stuff to work. It wasn't economically feasible, among other things, but I didn't actually enjoy working on it. Just because it was the most challenging thing that I thought I could do, just because I thought it was world-changing, doesn't necessarily mean that you like the day-to-day of it. And at the end of the day, and I say this as somebody who's had success, it's not the money that matters as much as it is how you work, the people you work with, the way that it challenges you. And so I did a lot of reflection on that trail and realized I am never going to be maybe the scientist that I thought or the inventor that I thought when I was getting my PhD that I eventually dropped out of. But I was really good at making complicated things like finance, kind of boring things, accessible and usable and beautiful in terms of the software. And I sort of gave myself permission to be me and be okay with recognizing I'm not even going to be the best engineer, but I'm good at it. I'm not going to be the best at algorithms, but I'm pretty good at the machine learning stuff. And so, I settled into a startup that I knew that if I pushed myself, I could achieve. And I pushed myself in the exact way that I wanted to, making something complicated simple, making the user interface beautiful, adding algorithms not for the sake of the technology, but to improve the product, doing things that algorithmically are not cutting edge. They've been done for 5, 10, even 15 years, but are cutting edge in that industry. Just because they aren't the things that Google, Facebook, whatever, the fear that you get as a technologist that you're not at the absolute bleeding edge, you forget that the bleeding edge actually takes like 30 years to percolate through the rest of industry. And so I just became comfortable with all of that, and I feel like I'm back in my stride as the combination of business, product, and engineering.
Where do you think that comfort comes from?
Part of it is probably getting outside of Silicon Valley. Part of it is age and the reflection that comes from spending 5 months in the wilderness, and just understanding what's important in life and the world. A lot of technology is frankly pointless, and in fact, tech is only a means to an end to save us time or money or improve our health or improve our happiness. It's literally just a means to an end, but engineers don't think like that. We're not trained to think like that. Tech is cool and it's nerdy and you just get really into it. But realizing all of that, when you're on a trail and you're like, who cares about this machine learning in this app? Like, hot water was the greatest of man's invention. I could use a shower right now. Toilets that you don't have to dig with a stick. Fantastic invention. Flat beds and padding and roofs. Fire. Still man's best invention. So it puts things in perspective.
And it makes you super grateful for a lot of the things as well. Again, obviously Mint has had an incredible story, and I'm sure most of the listeners are pretty familiar with Mint's success. But just going back, what was the genesis of the idea and the sort of first few months of, really taking Mint to market, and then, seeing the rapid growth that the company sort of saw?
Yeah, so the genesis of Mint was I was using competing tools. That would be Quicken and Microsoft Money. Since I was a teenager, I started some web development businesses, and I was always sort of commingling my personal and business finances. And I hadn't been into Quicken in a couple of months, and there were 100 transactions that sort of needed to be categorized, and I was like, why am I manually doing all of this? I bet I could write something that looks up the little names that are in the transactions and correlates them with basically the yellow pages at the time, or Google Places or whatever database you want to use now, and figures out what category they are and where they are and how often I go there, and wouldn't that be interesting? And so I just prototyped that algorithm, and then I realized that there was much more than just that basic tech there in terms of the need for a product that gives you a complete financial picture, which at the time you sort of had to log into each of your banks separately. At the time, your banks were just a balance and a bunch of often garbage transactions. They didn't even say a clean merchant name. They said AMZ asterisk CM, not com, CM. And then there was no space, and then it was like a bunch of numbers and garbage characters. And so parsing that was a little difficult. But we actually had the opportunity to, American Express actually copied parts of our design, a couple of years after we launched. I feel like we've actually had a big design impact on fintech in particular. And I wish I could have brought it to Australia and the rest of the world. I went as far as moving to Surrey Hills and buying mint.com.au, had an office in Singapore to start things in Southeast Asia, personally opened a bunch of bank accounts in New Zealand, like 6 in one day. Probably put up some international money laundering flags or something. But just to try to get the core infrastructure up and running. But Intuit wasn't a very international company, really just US and Canada centric, and so they pulled the plug on it sort of after we were acquired, which is quite unfortunate, because there's still really not anything like that here in Australia.
Yeah. And you were the solo founder of Mint?
Yeah, I was the solo founder. I guess it doesn't always happen that way, but I was fortunate enough to have the tech background, and I initially thought I was just going to be the CTO or something. I'd have to find a CEO, but I was fortunate enough when I went to Duke University in North Carolina in the U.S. And in addition to computer science, electrical engineering, I took classes in financial and managerial accounting to learn a bit about the business side. And I don't know, once you can do multivariate calculus, the business side of things seemed relatively straightforward to me. So I ended up doing that as well.
Sure. So, obviously there's conventional wisdom in terms of how to operate or how to grow a startup, and one of them is, you need the co-founders and you need to go down a particular path. What were there sort of a unique set of challenges, or did you ever have that feeling of maybe I should bring on an additional co-founder or have that additional support, or were you sort of pretty confident in terms of you had the necessary skills that you needed to execute from the get-go?
I'd love to tell you that I was confident, but that's not true. Anybody's ever started a company, particularly in tech, if they're honest, will tell you that it's actually an emotional roller coaster, and that you wake up days and you're like, my net worth is draining. All of my friends from college are, moving up in their corporate jobs at IBM or Microsoft or Google or whatever. I'm just sitting in my apartment coding. There's no way I'm going to beat. Who am I to take on Microsoft and Intuit, these publicly traded companies? I'm 25 and I don't know what I'm doing. And then the next day you're like, heck yeah, I'm going to change everything. So you oscillate back and forth between there. And if you don't have serious doubts about your own abilities and about your career choices while you're doing something crazy like a startup, then you're probably a sociopath or something. It's just completely normal to have plenty of doubts. It doesn't mean that there's anything defective or that you won't succeed in the end. It just means that it's just the human journey. But I got far enough along that at a certain point, there wasn't even thought of a co-founder because I was sort of 6 months in. I had hired a couple of other engineers, paid them out of my personal savings, and we were far enough along that I was able to, after getting about 50 no's, got my first yes from a venture capitalist. At the time, this cloud computing was fairly new, so I actually just had a server running on my laptop. It was in the trunk of my car, parked out in the parking lot. Someone said, yeah, that sounds interesting. I was like, what? You think that's interesting? Everyone else just said no straight away. So I ran out and got it and did a demo, and that was Josh Koppelman of First Round Capital, so I owe a lot to him and to First Round for taking a gamble. And then once he came on, some people who were on the fence just piled on, and we raised $750,000, which seemed like an infinite amount of money back then, and it was a $3 million pre-money valuation. a lot of times in the Valley today, you see companies doing 10 or 12 straight out of the gate with no experience. But I thought it was amazing at the time, and it was.
So I've through the podcast, I've been fortunate to speak to some incredible founders, and you just touched on that every founder goes through the oscillation of this is amazing to what the hell am I doing?
Yeah.
And it's no different for companies that have traction and have been super successful as well.
I thought we were basically, a month away from failure, even when we were the market leader, because we didn't have that many resources, and I knew this was wrong, and I knew that was wrong, and then the Intuit CEO invited me to lunch, and he said that he wanted to talk about personal finance education, which was really a passionate topic of mine. I'd been doing a lot of personal finance writing for papers, and even putting personal finance education out to middle schools as an alternative math curriculum. And then that wasn't what he wanted to talk about at all. He just said, hey, how about $100 million for your company? I was like, whoa, I thought we were about to die. I mean, we weren't objectively. If I look backwards, we were doing fine and growing rapidly, but you have that mindset of everything's wrong, this is on fire, we need to fix that, we need to improve that. Why are users, failing over here and over there? So yeah, even when you're succeeding, you'll have plenty of doubts.
What was it a difficult decision for you to sell?
It's one that took me a few months to make, actually. One of the things that I did as soon as we got the acquisition offer a couple weeks later was I went to Costa Rica for 2 weeks. I think it was the first vacation I'd allowed myself in 3 years, and just took a surf and Spanish class and had a great time to reflect, and decided that I was young. I was 28 at the time, and I tried to get a better price, of course, and but put a win on the board. I had known friends who had offers for $200-300 million, didn't take them because they either wanted more or their venture capitalists told them to take more, and then those vanished because you never know when things are going to change. And Mint sold in the middle of the financial crisis. It was September 2009 is when we announced it, and it closed in November 2009. We were the very first acquisition for a 10 or 12 month period that was over $100 million. Period, after the global financial crisis.
Wow.
So we broke the streak, and some people, if you look up my name, Patzer, Patzer, in the Urban Dictionary, it actually has an entry for me called pulling a Patzer, which is selling your hot company too soon. But no one else was in that situation. There's a financial crisis. You don't know how bad it's going to get. They're like, this is the worst thing since the Great Depression. I was like, well, this seems like a great price. I could sort of solve that for me and for most of the early employees. So I took it.
Fantastic. And obviously just mindful of your time because you do have to get to meetings as well. Looking back, what would you say is your greatest superpower? And what do you think is one thing that you wish you had done differently?
Yeah, okay, so my greatest superpower I touched on earlier, which is the intersection of product, business, and engineering, which is to say, I can come up with an idea, I can prototype it and come up with the algorithms and prove that the technology is actually going to work, because I have a background in computer science and I code like a motherfucker. I mean, I'm not the best, but I crank code and I love it. So I can prototype it, but I have a good product sense. I do a lot of mock-ups in Sketch, or previously it was Balsamic or Photoshop or whatever in yesteryear, but I use Sketch a lot, and can make it look reasonable. And I really care about information architecture, and I care about the user journey, and I care about understanding the customer and doing a lot of research. And with Vital, I've done a bunch of overnight rounds in the emergency room where I'm sitting there with doctors and nurses and see people being wheeled through and see the pace of it all. And then the business sense, which is to understand how it's gonna make money. So it's the intersection of all of those things, and I'm not the world's best at at any one of them, but I'm pretty good at all three, and that helps. My the thing that I'm not the best at is when I'm a good engineer, I'm a shitty CEO. I get really irritated if somebody interrupts me while I'm in the middle of a stack trace. Debugging code takes a very different mindset than thinking big picture. And so I go through phases, and frankly, I need to get out of the engineer's phase, which I'm still in, to think a little bigger picture about sales and marketing. But that will come, and I basically have to quit cold turkey and not do any coding for a while. The only reason I need to leave is because I'm in the fortunate position of also being an angel investor. And so I take pitches from companies in Australia, New Zealand, and some in the US. And if you want to help me, not code all the time and be a better CEO, and you happen to be in New Zealand, I'm definitely looking for people who are good at machine learning and server-side engineering. I program everything in Scala, which is a Java-compatible language. So that's been a big challenge for me lately, in part because Kiwis and Aussies don't seem to value equity in the same way that they do in Silicon Valley, where everybody's had a friend or a friend of a friend make $5-10 million at Twitter or Facebook. And so it's real. And here, there haven't been hardly any exits, and so no one values the equity the way they should. We pay well, but people are more... I always give people 3 job offers, which is like, here's $100,000 and 50,000 shares, and here's $90,000 and, 70,000 shares. And they always take the ones that are like higher cash in here. And in the US, it was just the opposite, typically. But that's the big cultural difference, and that's something that I would personally like to change. So try to help any companies that I invest in. I try to mentor as many companies as I reasonably can while starting and running my own. So reach out to me on LinkedIn with some sort of message that tells me you heard me here and why I should help you out, because I get 5 or 10 of these a day. But I do actually respond, particularly to people who have really good visual mock-ups of what they're working on. I love that. So that's what I'm about to go do now, is help somebody doing a fintech startup here in Australia.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for squeezing us in. Hope to get you back on the show sometime and get an update on Vital when you've got a bit more time as well. And so LinkedIn's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah, I think so. Vital doesn't even have a website at this point because we're completely product focused and we're still sort of stealthy, just going through our first sort of trial customers. So yeah, LinkedIn is definitely the best.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that link is in the show note. Aaron, once again, thanks for your time and for sharing your experience and insights on the show today.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 72 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Aaron, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. A quick reminder to keep an eye out for the Startup Playbook Hustle launching later this week. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the next episode.